So, let's make a start here. So as I have to give you the welcome today, it's obviously a great pleasure for me to do this. Welcome to everybody, and welcome to everybody who's listening to us online. And I thank you for being here. There's not only French people here, not only those who are in the hall here today, because of course we have the holiday period just now with the break last Thursday. So of course you've made a very good decision to come here today, and you will see that the light will shed in our discussions will be very useful to you. Will show you the interest that you're going to have an interesting time here. I'm Eric Andrea. I'm a European deputy. I'm vice president of the Social Democrats. And it's been up to me to organize this event with the under responsibility of Rachi Perez, and I'll welcome her again later on a bit more length. And I would also like to bring into this my efforts today, those people who are involved in the coordination, all the European deputies, members of the European Parliament, notably Mr. Guillaume, who's head of the French Social Democrats at the European Parliament. Nora Bebarek, of course. And we would be nothing, of course, without her presence. Also Rafael Glucksmann and others who have not been able to here, who are not here today, but who have helped us in our work. Also working with Nicola, of course, who's in the team. Javier. And he's also helped us with the links between France and Spain. And then Pedro Marques, who's our Portuguese leader, who's worked with us in a long time, working on the report. And you'll see him later on in the video. And he's made a big effort to help us with all the work we have done. You've made the right decision, because let me admit something. This is a rare moment amongst the progressive family. This is going to be an exceptional time, I think. I can declare this. You won't be disappointed, because I'm sure that this type of meeting will allow you and allow us, let's say, in all humility, to shed sense on our commitment as socialists and social democrats. And this is the main purpose of what we're doing today. Why are we in Paris? We're here for two main reasons. The first is that everybody's aware of this, of course, that there's been the Paris Agreement, the COP. And given all the commitments made at that time, and we'll talk about this in debates later on, this is the last day, of course. So we're told, maybe it's not over, of course, for talking about the COP26, COP26 at Glasgow. Of course, I would say that France is relatively marginal in this, but we'll talk about that a bit later on. So it's been important for us to organize this event in Paris in alliance or on the sidelines of the COP26. There's also a second reason, and particular, and this is because in Paris we have a mayor who stands as a symbol, an exceptional person, especially with regard to what we're discussing today. And of course, I'm talking about Anne Hidalgo. And she's received the World UN Prize in terms of climate and environmental issues for the city, and that certainly deserves a few claps. That shows that the thinking undertaken by the social democrats of the European Parliament is carried, let's say, within Paris. So we decided on this report and this work. Let's say virtually the third reason why we're here this afternoon. Thanks to another woman of exceptional qualities, Irache Garcia Perez, the president of our Social Democrat group. She deserves an applause because since I started my mandate, I can say that things have not been going so well worldwide, let's say, since I took up my mandate. And as part of our responsibility to social democrats, we need to be humble enough to look at the situation as it applies at the moment, and that we organize serious debate so that we can formulate policy for the future. How should the Social Democrats be active, and what sort of strategy should they convey for the next 10, 15 years in view of the current realities, of course? And she, I say with great respect, has listened very carefully to the proposals we have made. She's a politician of substance who is able to give some impetus to our party. The problem is not simple because, though we've thought about this within the party ourselves, people outside don't know exactly how it functions, the various aspects that are not easy to understand from outside. So we decided in common basis for a second time running to create an independent commission or committee. So a group of people working around the same table to give a genuine European aspect. These experts have been trained, let's say, and encouraged by two exceptional people, and I'd like to thank them now. And on behalf of the Social Democrats, this is Teresa Ribera, the first vice president of Pedro Sanchez in Spain. I would like to congratulate her and thank her for her efforts here. And then secondly, Paul Rasmussen, and he deserves a clap as well, of course. I'd like to mention to him and express our delight that he's here. He was Prime Minister of Denmark, President of the PSE, and now he's here today to encourage us and create a vision for the Social Democrats on a European scale for the future. So I'd like to express my respect and admiration for him and his capacity to provide a real momentum and insight into the future and to try and create this great shift in the world that we've talking about this afternoon. And we have three experts of substance here. Enrico Giovannini, who was expert in the first panel, and he became in the second minister and became a minister as well in terms of Minister of Mobility in Italy. And I'd like to thank him for his efforts and perseverance and his contribution to our line of thought. Then Gustav Horn, in charge of the important role in the SPD in German. He will speak shortly. Then Eloi Laurent, senior economist at the OFC and at Sciences Po, and as well as at Paris Tech. And he has made a major contribution to our efforts. They've worked throughout the year in order to allow us to construct our report. So everybody makes their contribution here, and their efforts have been vital in creating this momentum as of this afternoon. Hope and others who've helped us here. So I'd like to thank you, everybody who's involved in that respect. So we've produced a report, and it's not just any report, but it gives clear insight into the situation, and the experts have been completely free to describe the situation and express their thoughts. First of all, so we're not just a think tank, we're more in the logic of making proposals. We have to note and observe, but above all, we need to propose, and in this way, we can ensure this great shift. And this is the main drive behind this report. So I'm delighted to be here on behalf of you, of course, and I'd like to welcome our leaders who will be able to express their points of view shortly, and they will give their view of the current situation. Mr. Fafovics, who will have the round table later on, Emma Rafovich, and then Lawrence Tubiana, who will be speaking later on. She's just come from the COP26 in Glasgow, and she'll be at this roundtable too. And then also later on we'll have Olivier Faure, and then Sergei Stanishev, who will be here shortly. Also Antonio Costa, former Prime Minister of Portugal, Anne Hidalgo, the Paris mayor, and Pedro Sanchez, head of the Spanish government. So before moving on, I wouldn't want to forget those who've helped. Mr. Compitelis, who is there today, who I'd like to thank him for being president. Mr. Perez will be joining us later on, and he has, of course, made a major impact of the PS within the European Parliament. They will all be speaking later on, and in particular, they will be talking about this rather lengthy and heavy report. So you have a shortened version which you can refer to. So you can see that online, and this will give you insight into this report. So we're talking about the great shift from a broken world to sustainable well-being. Let me change micro here a second. Okay, let's go. So it's a report which makes clear proposals of a radical nature. I say they're radical because the world in which we are now active, we can say that we can no longer wait for things to develop. We have many proposals, many of them regarding the long term, because we, the Socialists, the Social Democrats, as progressists, we believe that we need to create a vision for the future. We need to construct a story for the future, and with regard to the medium term as well as the long term, and not just quick action in the short term. The pandemic we've been facing has revealed the need to shift policy in a major way. We no longer have the choice but to move on from the intense competition in the capitalist world, focused on the short term at the expense of the medium term, based on economic issues and the accumulation of wealth, with more and more wealth concentrated in a few hands and on a global scale. And this has created huge damage in terms of well-being and on the planet. So for over 40 years, this neoliberal model and this obsession for growth and economic growth, which has concentrated wealth in a few hands, has gone hand in hand with the increase in unemployment, poverty, and precariousness. And it has also undermined climate and biodiversity. Can we continue to tolerate this situation? In other words, can we just continue to accept capitalism to dominate via excessive use of resources? Can we continue to accept that the 1% of the richest in the world hold 44% of world wealth, or that 21% of European citizens, or more than 89 million people, should be regarded as exposed to risk of poverty and exclusion, or that 40% of the profits of multinationals should be transferred to fiscal paradises. And you know that 31% of Europeans are in a position to cope with unforeseen expenses. They can't replace their washing machines, for example. So is world economic growth, does it still make sense if it doesn't encourage and increase well-being amongst the average citizen? This is clearly the case that it's not acceptable. As progressists, as social democrats, we must invent a new model for the future, focused on well-being, both for humans and the planet as a whole. And this is our guide lodestar for the future. We must replace GDP with well-being. This is the right time to look beyond GDP and capitalism. Capitalism has been an unacceptable model, which is unjust and inhuman. And this dysfunction is created a huge range of problems, and we need to deal with all of this as a joint community to deal with all the challenges and to provide coherent solutions. We're facing what we can call as a meta-crisis, that in terms of the climate in particular, and this is fitted in with the capitalist notions that prevail today. If you look around, you can see extreme heat, the impact of extreme heat, climate, of hurricanes, etc., and the damage to biodiversity. And this is becoming the main cause of mass migration this century. And it may well turn out to encourage extreme populism in the future. And this is a clear danger of increased social insecurity from this development of the climate situation. The current situation cannot be tolerated and accepted. We do not have clear enough solutions to current challenges. So we need proposals in terms of energy, trade, and also we face a real social threat, because within Europe we have not had sufficient will to provide a clear social agenda associated with the climate issue. So in the Oporto summit, we tried to deal with this, and the measures created there, I do not think really face with the challenges we now face in social terms as associated with the ecological situation. We must provide clear answers to these social and ecological issues. And to deal with ecological issues, we must provide a social solution. Otherwise, it will not work. We must have a clear alliance between ecologists and those who are in favor of social progress. And this is clearly laid out in our report. And it's within this notion of a climate crisis, there is a way forward. and this is based on well-being and reduction of inequalities and development, and not just focused on economic development. So as socialists, as social democrats, we need to provide a vision of this society. So now, so that we can continue with our debate, I'd like now to call on Emma, who would like to conduct the first roundtable, and then we can you'll have greater insight into the report. And I thank you, Emma, for conducting this first discussion. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. So I'm Emma Radovic. I'm involved in the social party in terms of mobilization for the young and associated with the Paris mayor. It's a delight to be here today. And I'm going to talk about all this major issues to ensure this great shift. The coronavirus pandemic has clearly shown that we have urgent issues to deal with, and notably that ecology and socialism are clearly intertwined. The climate issue is impacting social issues. It's clear that we need to ensure a radical shift in our economic model going forward. The current crisis shows the limits and contradictions within our current way of living and in our current models in a globalized world which is overly dictated by too many private economic interests and accumulation of wealth, and dominated by neoliberal philosophy. And climate and planet are being consistently undermined and people left to one side. And the Great Shift report for the Social Democratic in the Parliament clearly indicates that the situation is serious in social, economic, and environmental terms. But this report also provides some clear solutions and 242 proposals, in fact, and they will help us to provide a vision for the future and ensure increased well-being. And this, of course, is our main ambition. So the young are clearly driving for moves in terms of the climate change. And they are also very much focused on social justice during the confinement and the health crisis. We've seen that a lot of the young have tried to help out. There's an association in Paris, for example, called Copain, which was helping ensure that other young people were not left hungry. So what we're trying to do today is to provide clear steps forward and to show the links between social justice and ecological development. So the European Social Democrats with Eric and Irache, they show that we are in tune with realities, and this is reflected in the report. And as a Social Democrats, we are on the left, and we are clearly focused on current realities. So before convening the other speakers, I'd like to refer to a video from Teresa Rodriguez. She's in charge of Commission for Sustainable Equality. She hasn't been able to attend today, but she has sent this over the line, let's say. I would have liked to have been here today for this great report. It's been a delight to work with you, to meet this major challenge, and to provide answers that the progressives need to provide. But in fact, I will be in Glasgow working for the
equitable and fair future, working for new opportunities of employment, for a much more equitable access to the ecosystem's benefits, and so on. something that was very present in our discussions along the last months. I think that it has been a great pleasure to work together with Paul and all the members of the Commission, and of course the technical team that has been providing a big support during the last months. The world, the value chains, the society has been changing very, very deeply in very few months, and we need to provide some responses. We have the responsibility to facilitate opportunities for all, but we also to anticipate where the challenges may be and how we can respond to the bottlenecks, to the unfairness situations that the transformations, the turbulence may provide. Our societies, our intellectuals, even our parties and organizations have been thinking in big terms, have been thinking in the macroeconomic benefits of working together in a small planet called Earth. And it is time to pay attention not only to the macroeconomic figures, but also to the very citizen, very individual citizen situation, how to ensure equity among us. This is what we have been trying to work on and to reflect in this report, how we can pay attention to every individual, how we can pay attention to these aspects of fairness and equity when combining the big picture with the very small picture, how to provide a much more equal society all over the world. The big challenge is to build a pathway that allows us to combine the healthy planet we need with the prosperity every citizen claims for. We have tried to provide some question marks, but also some possible answers to some of these very key issues. How we can combine these demands from the citizens with the politics so to facilitate this transformation, paying attention to prosperity, fairness and equity, taking into consideration what well-being may be in the time to come, but also paying attention to the injustice that we already perceive in our society. The good news is that we are convinced that we can do it. We can make this combination in a very bold, clear statement. We try to provide some inputs on how to get it. It is not just a question of intellectual definition, it is also a complete list of recommendations on how to handle this transformation. And in this context, the notion of just transition becomes clear. Just transition dealing with workers, just transition dealing with consumers, just transition among different countries, just transition within the same society at the very same time. Different dimensions need to be combined. Space, so geography and territorial cohesion, social, individual, human aspects of this transformation, and the economic parameters so to ensure that what we do is within the planetary limits. This has always been our agenda. Inclusiveness, fairness, thinking in today, but also thinking into the future. And we need to revitalize this agenda. We need to go through the different parameters, through the different difficulties we are facing. We need to pay attention to the youth, people that is already asking for the great answers they expect from the institutions, from the great answers they expect from politics. And it is our responsibility to provide some of these answers, to facilitate the building of this new pathway towards the future. How many times we have been speaking about the new social contract, a new social green deal, something that it is already embedded in the European politics. It is our project, but it is not our project only within our own society. It should be our project towards the rest of the world. We need to be consistent domestically and in the external dimension of our politics. And at the same time, we need to introduce, as I said before, this time dimension. The transition also speaks about the different generations, combining the illusions, the dreams, but also the expectations and responsibilities among generations. And this is passionate, and this is the core of our discussions and the core of the report we want to share with you today. Thank you so much for providing me this great opportunity to work with you all. Thanks to all the comments, very smart comments, coming from all the members of this commission, and of course, thanks to our great social progressive family.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for that. So, to talk about this report, in our first roundtable, it's necessary. I'd like to call on, first of all, Enrico Giovannini. Minister of Sustainable Infrastructures, also a professor at Rome University Tor Vergata. So we should have names on the seats there. And also Gustav Horn, member of the executive board of the SPD, professor of economics at Duisburg-Essen University, and Eloi Laurent, senior economist at the FCE and professor at Sciences Po, Paris Tech, and also active at Stanford, and Paul Rasmussen, co-chair of the Independent Commission for Sustainable Equality, former Prime Minister of Denmark and former president of the Party of European Socialists. Right, thank you very much for attending. We're delighted that you've accepted to speak with me and everybody who's here. So in the report which we're talking about today, we speak that the crisis, social crisis and climate issues are not crises that are present in present, but they're highly interdependent. In fact, we're perhaps talking about one overall global crisis. So we need to think about systemic change for the future. Paul, so if you agree, I'd like to first question, could you explain why you view it as essential to speak of crisis or meta-crisis as being interdependent and systemic change? Well, thank you.
I think that talking about the meta-crisis, as we do in this report, is a very logical consequence of the simple fact that we have never before, since the Second World War, had a handful of each and every one of serious crises, but we have never had them all together in the same time. We have an economic crisis, we have an environmental crisis, we have an inequality and poverty crisis, we have a social crisis, all together. And according to our traditional wisdom, we should first tackle the economics, and then we should try to tackle the others point by point, but that's not possible anymore. Because all the 5 crises are interconnected, interrelated. It's like a puzzle. If you take one brick out, there's the other ones you have to tackle also at the same time. So the meta-crisis, Emma, need to have a meta-answer, which is the great shift. What I'm saying is that listen to Glasgow right now. It's very important what they do. But if the conclusion in Glasgow will mean that we have now our focus on the environment only, and we leave it to the market to solve the problems, that will not be a game changer. We cannot make conclusions in Glasgow without making very serious and legally binding frames for the greediness and the short-termism on the capital markets. No long-term sustainable solutions without great shift on the capital market, in the economic system, in the social system, and so on. Now, you would think, is that really possible, Paul? I would say, number one, we have a UN decision talking about goals which are very binding up till 2050. We had in Paris a very short time ago some conclusions on climate, and we have now the youngsters engaging themselves, which Emma talked about. And at the end of the day, we have a very progressive and very fundamental analysis here, and I think it's fair to say, friends, that the starting points in this new European Commission and European Parliament, the first 2 years here, begin slowly to open the doors to reforming our way of thinking economically. Maybe, friends, we are starting now to have Euro bonds. Maybe we can develop bazookas on the financial markets with a European power. What I'm saying is, we have the hope now, and it's time to act now. And Emma, allow me just shortly to mention 2 points here, concrete, in the 242 concrete legislation proposal, guys. Don't tell we're not concrete, huh? let me number one say, to make it work, this new ambition of the Great Shift, you need to have overall binding, legally binding goals in the European Union. One legally binding goals could be that we would eradicate power until 2030, 50. Another one could be, and a very necessary one could be, a legal binding framework for accountable capital markets in the future. You cannot have this environmental focus without having a legally binding accountable capitalism to bear it through. So my point finally is, if we can make decisions where we have the goals together, and then we act on the European level, then we act on the national level, then we act on the local level, and what we do at all these three levels are contributions to the great goals we are defining as legally binding goals on a European level. That's the way to go to make it all hang together, to have a great shift as the answer to the META crisis. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. The world we're living in today is actually stark with inequalities. So 1% of the most rich are earning more than half of the poor population in the world. In Europe, we've had social movements who've actually rallied several citizens around social injustice, like the Yellow Jackets in France. Many citizens can actually realize that our society is extremely unjust, and there is so much of inequality that's lasting. Enrico Giovannini, in the report, we're talking about economic model that does not only focus on the GDP as the sole measure. Now, to what extent we need to take into account not just GDP, but also other factors as well.
Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you to Paul and Teresa for chairing this fantastic commission. I think that what we learned with this dramatic pandemic is that we can change. Maybe we don't like to change too much, but we can. And we can do that for the best, although in a very difficult situation. I was member of the first commission, and had the pleasure to prepare the first report that influenced a lot the way in which progressive parties and even the commission, I think, run their, first of all, the elections, and then the preparation of the program work. I'm saying that, I'm underlining that because, of course, some people can say, well, these are just dreams. No, they can be put in place. And let me just share with you one point that is related to the answer that I'm going to give you now. 6 years ago, with the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development, we launched the idea of change the constitution to include the intergenerational equity in our constitution. And I was told, you're crazy, we will never change it. Well, in a few months, this will happen. The concept of intergenerational equity is at the core of this report. Because when we talk about sustainable equality, this is what we mean. And sustainable equality for all. So intergenerational equity, intragenerational equity. These are the two fundamental principles that we suggest to use to build the new policies. In this perspective, we have to recognize that our accounting systems do not care about this. GDP doesn't do that. We clearly demonstrated 20 years ago when I was chief statistician at the OECD here in Paris, and then the Stiglitz Commission and so on and so forth. So we can say that some things have changed, also in the way in which the European union works. Indicators for environmental phenomena, social phenomena are much more prominent now than before. But at the end of the day, the headlines of our newspapers are about GDP or the stock exchange variations. Or, I was just thinking today, incredibly, there is another daily data that is on our headlines every day, the number of people who are infected by COVID. So what I'm just using, if you wish, this bad example to say that we can turn our attention to things that we measure. And this is where I think we can do a big, big step forward based on 2 points. The first, in 1944, the US government called the best economists at the time from US and UK, deciding how to build the GDP. And the British approach, based on the quantity of stuff produced, won. Because at the time, the political problem was to demonstrate that capitalism was able to produce more stuff than communism, as simple as that. I think that now Europe can do what the US did in 1944 and set world new standards based on the concept of sustainable well-being for all. Data are available. We need to build a new framework for the 21st century, where the equality problems, both intergenerational and intragenerational dimensions, count. Second point, we have recognized finally, and the Commission as well, that the future will be full of shocks. Therefore, the concept of resilience that few years ago was refused because politicians didn't want to tell people that the future was quite turbulent, now is a common word, but the future, as will be full of shock, requires change in the way in which we prepare our policies. In this report, the concept of resilience is central, but not resilience just to go back to where we were before the crisis, but the idea of bouncing forward, take the shocks, even positive shocks, to bounce forward. And this is not counted in our statistics. Just to conclude, as from the moment that I'm Minister of Infrastructures and Sustainable Mobility, who is asked to deal with the Recovery and Resilience Plan, we planned a lot of initiatives, a lot of investments, and in our report, we didn't write down how much GDP this will produce. We show how many jobs this will produce, how much the territorial inequality will decrease by 38%, and the CO2 emissions that will be cut through this initiative. It's just to say that even with the current data, we can change the narrative according to what the report says, but we need to make this jump also to help the rest of the world to go in this direction.
Obviously, this is what we've been speaking about. There's so many crises that exist. There's an economic crisis, social crisis, and we're talking a lot about environmental crisis these days. But even though it's rather alarming, Laurent, I've got a question for you. What is the place of social justice in a European socialist policy? How can we make sure that social progress can coexist with progress? First of all, I'm really glad to be here and participate in the second report, because this is the second report of the ICSE. This is a work that started in 2010. I'd like to thank Marshall Mersch, who is a major architect of this commission and in this work. I also would like to very quickly say why this report is so important. It is important because it's the first time that at the European level we've spelled out the need for a change. Well-being and social ecology. So what is well-being? It's all about moving from GDP-based growth to a well-being-based growth. The GDP-based growth is actually destroying our system, and we are also basically downgrading well-being and biodiversity. These systems, current systems, are actually not sustainable. It's an auto-destructive system that we see day to day, and this report confirms the necessity to actually move on to another guide that basically is centered on well-being, which is the central compass. And the real change is the socio-ecological change. It's about taking both considerations into account. We are almost drawing to the end of the COP26. We're talking about climate. There is the socio-ecological change and the well-being change, and all this is basically enshrined in the IPCC report. If you read that report, you will see that there is one practical scenario for humanity, which is the SSP1 scenario. Now, what is the scenario? It is based on the assumption that we have to bridge social inequalities to move from a GDP-centered economy to a well-being-centered economy. We have to really have a practical approach, something that is recognized by the scientific community as the way out, for the 21st century. And it's not just the IPCC report, it's also the reports issued by other organizations. In every report, there is a scientific consensus that says that you really need to have, you need to bridge social inequalities, otherwise we'd be actually heading to the destruction of humanity. This is why this report is of pivotal importance. The EU cannot be governed now as in the light of budgetary indicators. You really cannot have a European project. You really cannot have a European project in the 21st century on mistrust and auto-destruction of well-being. We really need to build it on cooperation and human welfare and well-being. And this report actually comes out with concrete ways to move to these indicators. It's not about building indicators just for the sake of building them. We really want a well-being policy. We don't want well-being indicators. We want a well-being policy. And this started at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We really need a well-being policy, and this report is actually focused on this well-being policy. In the second part, the answer to your second part of your question, socio-ecological change. Now, in the beginning of 21st century. In fact, it started when 4 billion people were under lockdown because we destroyed the biodiversity. We really have to sacrifice these social links to rise up to the crisis. And for us, this is the beginning of the 21st century. There are 3 crises, in fact. You have the ecological crisis, inequality crisis, and we've got the democratic crisis. Now, the question is to understand understand that there is an intrinsic link between the crisis. As our world is, if our world is going to be sustainable, it will be fair. So we really need to resolve ecological crisis and at the same time also mitigate the social crisis. And this is exactly what the report's talking about. Let me give you an example. And we have destabilized the atmosphere over the past 50 years. We've got ecological crisis. It's going to come in different waves. And you've got COVID, climate, COVID, and it's going to actually last for another few years. And unfortunately, we're going to have the return of seasons, but there's going to be an ecological shock. So there's going to be spells of pandemic and spells of heat waves. But we really have to look at the problem in its face if to have a protective mechanism, socio-ecological protective mechanism. France is considered to have a temperate climate. There is a huge climate risk. Look at the vulnerability indexes. France is at the 8th position in terms of the people, in terms of the countries that are most exposed. Since it has had 6 murderous heat waves, and forecasts say that these heat waves are going to be the major problem, and they're going to actually struck vulnerable populations. And France is fragile, and France have poor health. Now there's going to be an ecological crisis ravaging a vulnerable population. Now this is not apocalyptic at all. We have to build protections. We've understood that old age, ill health is all social crisis. We need to have protection, and we really need to make sure that we have a socio-ecological state and not just a well-being state. We really need to change our protection system and integrate the ecological component in order to protect the most vulnerable, in order to rise up to the challenges of the 21st century. When we would have mitigated these crises, we will then move on to the second part of the 21st century, where we can hope that well-being is going to reign. But waiting for this, we really need to protect ourselves, and this report calls for that, mitigating crisis through well-being and also protecting ourselves through the socio-ecological change. So I'm sorry for having such doom and gloom rhetoric, but we really have more means in the 21st century. So we really have to seize this opportunity and rebuild our public policy in light of the current change. Now, what you said, in the report, actually, we're talking about capitalism and our current model, and also the obsession with the GDP and growth and the climate crisis and the social crisis. At the European level, we feel that there is lack of 900 billion to have satisfying socio-ecological infrastructure. So this is a kind of a provocation. Now, the politicians are not doing things that what they should be doing. Can you tell me what is the role of the politicians in the current crisis?
Say that I'm very proud to be here today to say that I have been part of this very, very important report that has been directed, for example, by Paul and Teresa. And so I'm very proud to be here and to speak about it. Referring to the question, yes, we politicians are under heavy criticism. And certainly there are good reasons for that, because in the past years, not enough things have been done to avoid all these sorts of crises we have talked about already. But I think there's a special role now for the Social Democrats and Socialists in the ongoing decades now to meet the challenges of our century. And at this time now, I can say many people trust us to meet these challenges, as, for example, the recent election results in Germany show. But this gives us also a very heavy responsibility to do something.
And one of the main responsibilities we have now, and we have to change right now, is that we address the common root of this meta-crisis we have talked about. Because there is a common root of all these crises, of the financial crisis, of the pandemic, of the looming climate crisis, of the migration crisis. And the common root is, it's the wrong approach, the neoliberal approach to globalization. Many of these things that we are missing, that we are suffering from, are global public goods, as we economists say. These are goods which are common goods, not private goods, not goods you can make profits on. And because there are no goods you can make profits on, they are not there. And that explains that we have still no sufficient financial stability on the markets. That explains that we still have no global protection against pandemia enough, that our healthcare system is not sufficiently equipped to deal with the peaks of such pandemias, that the climate crisis, the reduction of emissions, is not going too far enough to be sustainable for our global issues. So what politicians have to do now, and what politics has to do now, is to change the balance between state and market. In the past time, the market was a superpower of global progress and of globalization. This has to change. We have to put more power on economic policy, on state activity. But it's not the national state. It's not France, it's not Germany that can solve these problems on its own. They're too small, simply. We have to find a global cooperation, and Glasgow is now an expression of this attempt. But at least we have to find a cooperation on the European level to be significant for these global public goods. So Europe has to become a role model for the future in this sense. And this means we need a different kind of European economic policy. We need a European policy in its own right. Not just from a national perspective, but from a European perspective. That means we need a European fiscal policy. And that means we have to change the fiscal rules in Europe. The rules as they are right now are not appropriate to deal with the challenges of this century. So we have to change them. And that's one challenge for politicians to do right now. We have to change these rules, especially as social democrats, that all the investments we desperately need now to produce these global public goods are possible. We have to do a lot of investment. We have to do the investments of the century right now to change our economies and societies in a way they haven't been changing for ages. We have to leave the present industrial age to a new age of economy and society that is more digitalized and produces economically sustainable. But that means, if we look at that from a perspective of the ordinary people, we have to provide them alternatives of living where they can earn a decent income under these new circumstances. And we have to outline that in our reports. That means we need to provide them with jobs where they can earn a decent living. And that means we have to set up new production lines. Instead of coal mining, building different kind of cars and producing different ways of energy. And that all requires a lot of investment, a lot of money. And in order to get that money, we have not just to change the routes. We also have to address the problem of inequality. Because given this huge inequality, especially in wealth, it is totally unfair that just ordinary people pay for this change. We have to tax the wealthy much more heavily than we did in the past. And that's also a challenge for politicians right now. Sort of emphasis now, because in Germany we're right now in the process of fixing some points of this. And I can tell you, it is difficult. Resistance is also still there. And the majorities, we need to do that, are not for safe right now. So the fight goes on, but we can do change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The word ecology, being ecology, is actually having a greater meaning in the political debate. You know, as social democrats, we're not just discussing amongst ourselves, but we have been working on these questions for a very long time. And I have a question for Paul. As the former Prime Minister and as the President of the Party of European Socialists, and as a social democrat in Europe, we are basically spearheading a new political radical change, and we basically are people who take ownership of what we do and not just say things in the air. Can you tell us what is your definition of being a European social democrat and a socio-ecologist? Can you tell me what is your take on that commitment?
Well, I would say that just to have two words about my own country, Denmark, right? I think it's fair to say that we have decided by legislation in the parliament that we should reduce the CO2 emission with 70% up till 2030. I did not say 2050, I said 2030. 2030, right? That means around from 8 years from now, 70% reduction of CO2. Now, would that be possible? And at the same time, as you said, and my three colleagues said, having a more equal society, right? And at the same time, having a better employment, and at the same time, ensuring lesser inequality and better education. We have made a plan now, Emma. We have a surplus on our balance of payment, on our public finances, and people are said to be the happiest people in the world. Now, how could that be? I think it could be, I think the secret is that we have the lessest social unconsciousness in this welfare society of the Nordic countries. So, what I'm trying to say on the next part of your question is, these Nordic countries feel they are the best countries in the world, right? And that Europe should try to make a copy of them. You know, the smaller you are, the more bigger you are going to be, right? So what we need now is not to give power back to the nations, because our problem is that the nationalism in our European Union is becoming stronger and stronger, and the European feeling is becoming weaker and weaker. And that is why what Gustav Horn said just a minute ago, that we need among progressives and socialists to once and for all define that the European Union is not something you take away from the national decisive power, it's something you give to all of us, right? It's our new chance of taking back what the capitalism took from us in the years who passed. I'm just saying, I'm so fed up with the quick fix talk, right? The quick fix is populist talk. What we're talking about is that we can only solve these problems we're defining today in a long-term existing strategy, right? And to make that long-term existing strategy and to try to diminish the competition between the countries is to strengthen the European Union. I would only end up by saying that in the 1930s, as you were talking about, Roosevelt in the United States made a contra policy to the crisis defined by capitalism, and we made all the years after a sort of global new compromise between state and market. Now, Gustav, we have to take back that compromise, that balance. We have to tell the capitalism now, guys, it's time that you draw a little bit back. It's time that you're becoming a little bit less greedy. It's time that you are acting a little bit more long-term, and we should ensure that you're doing it, because we want to reshape this balance between state and market and people should be in the center.
So since the beginning of the discussion, we've talked about the importance of being able to make radical choices and to really change things. As a social democrat, we know how attached we are to democracy, and this is, of course, part of our European ideal. A question for Enrico Giovannini: is the democratic model now suited to achieving these aims? What major democratic progress can we make in order to accompany this advance in social terms?
1 billion euro question. The role of democracy is indeed very questioned by some people, especially if we consider that shocks will come and shocks will require quick reactions, but also the capacity, as Paul was saying, to prepare in the long term for avoiding those shocks. Democracy is absolutely a vital part of our culture and our dream, if I can say. But how to do that in practice? As I was mentioning, my ministry has to implement a huge program of new infrastructures. And I revamped the idea of débat public, public debate that the previous government has put aside because was a complication, was something that could slow down the decisions. Without the engagement of local communities, there is no way to build sustainable infrastructures. And in Italy, a lot of people still have problems in thinking in these terms. But at European level, we are indeed confronted with a few, actually several, but especially few key points that I would like to make. The first is the so-called Hamiltonian moment, which is about, as we heard before, the decision to invest at European level and not just at national level. The US federal government level was not built just on a by design. It was a way to answer collectively to shocks. And from this point of view, we have to rethink deeply the concept of public finance, but especially the concept of investment. If you build an hospital, that is an investment. If you pay doctors to make it working, that is a current expenditure. Does it make any sense? People's life change because, not because you have built an hospital, but because people can get help there. And from this point of view, we need to change the fiscal rules, again, also the statistical rules, and be careful. Things are changing. The change by the Bank of England to consider the ESG, environment, social governance, dimensions, even for their monetary policy, when they have to buy private bonds, is a huge revolution. You have to take all our textbooks of macroeconomics and put in the recycle bin, because this is a radical change. What I'm trying to say is that some institutions are making big decisions, and I think that Europe should do the same. Just to conclude, why progressive parties should do that? Why is this something that the center-right parties are not set up for that? Let me mention here the sentence that said, according to Sir Nicholas Stern, the climate crisis is the most important and largest failure of the markets in the history of the world. Well, if you grew up believing just in the markets, it's tough to accept because it's your life. that should go in the recycled bin. While progressive parties and social democrats and socialist democrats always thought the markets are not good enough. And this is why, in my view, more and more people, because of the crisis or because of the COVID crisis, look at center-left parties with new eyes, which doesn't mean just assistance, but a vision that can help people to have hope in their future. And from this point of view, I think that we have discovered the economic unsustainability with the crisis in 2008-9, and then later on. The environmental unsustainability is now almost known by everybody, but with the COVID crisis, we understood that social unsustainability is as dangerous as the others. And this is where this report, pushing to have a comprehensive approach, a holistic approach to different crises, but also to different policies, can represent the basis for a big change in the EU, in EU countries, and I think also to show to the rest of the world that Europe can really lead the change towards a more sustainable well-being world for all.
So the last question before handing over to the floor for Elva Laurent. You painted a rather dark picture of the situation at the moment. I see that Social Democrats are active, that they're winning elections at the European level in terms of mayors, like Anne Hedegaard in Paris. We see change going ahead. Am I right to be optimistic? Well, I can't answer that directly to that question with regard to you, but are we right to be worried? I'm afraid so. I don't want to go back into the depressive cycle. We can try and look more to optimistic aspects, but seriously, in terms of the concerns of the young, I think the young really are worried. For example, children who don't sleep, and they're concerned about the future of the planet. As parents, of course, this is a major issue. And what is quite new now, and the first time, for example, since the Cold War, or perhaps even the World Wars, we can see that children are losing sleep over issues. And this needs taking seriously. The anxiety of the young is clearly of great importance. We see the media taking a distant approach to this, saying that the young are a bit exaggerated in creating a wave of anxieties about things which are not really true. No, in my view, it's a serious issue and it needs dealing with frontally. The young are legitimately asking about what's going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years. They understand what is happening. They're not inventing anything. They didn't invent climate change. They just want to listen to what is being said, and they understand that this anxiety is present amongst the adults. Adults don't have the answers. So this anxiety is a rational approach, let's say, as things stand at the moment, with the climate issues and the weakness of the political responses. The situation is very simple in this respect. Once we don't have real political answers and responses for these children, we won't. We need to reassure children, and that way can exit the ecological issues. Do we have institutions that are working to this end? The EU is a source of hope, but also a source of commitment. It's a source of hope because it's the first time that we have an organization of world ranking that shows that all that we undertake will be based on the climate issues. So we have the Green Deal, for example. This is the first time in the history of humanity that we have a world authority stating that everything we're doing will be under this umbrella. This is, of course, a major change. And the Green Deal is halfway between the COVID and the Gilets jaunes in France. So when we look at the Gilets jaunes issue in France and the green issue, we see that the word inequality is not even mentioned. And if you see what the EU is doing, has undertaken since the Green Pact, we see that justice is now is at the bottom of the page, but now it needs to become at the heart of future developments. And once the EU can do that and make it at the heart of the Green Deal, then we will really have an extremely powerful tool to make advances and ensure that social needs are met and the ecological requirements are met. We become optimistic by being committed to certain ends. So we need to transform the Green Deal into a fair social pact. And it's exactly what this report is proposing to do. We're trying to transform the Green Deal into a social transition. Europe will remain a peaceful undertaking, and it's a new strategy. When Mrs. van der Leyen talks about a pact for growth, she's mistaken. We're talking about social issues, which should be the main focus. The EU must focus on this, and I think this report will help to that end. Thank you very much. So we're coming to the end of this exchange within the panel. I'd like Eric to join us now to take part in discussions with the floor. Right, bravo. So, before taking some questions, we'd like today to have Andrew von Ham here, who's Andrew Burnham, who is Birmingham Mayor, who is here, and he would like to make a few points. So here's Andy Burnham then, and he would like to make a few points before we carry on. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, of course.
Bonjour.
It's an honor to be here today with my French friends and French and European friends.
For me, as the Mayor of Greater Manchester, to show support from the British left for this movement, calling for the great shift in the way our world is run, from one which is enriching the few to one which secures the well-being of all. We've already heard today about a broken world, a broken system. I'm just back from COP26, and I think we saw signs of it there. For every one Pacific negotiator at COP26, there were 12 fossil fuel lobbyists. And we've heard about the 1% who own 40% of the world's wealth. Well, they had a platform at COP. The billionaires were invited to speak, and it shows that we're still in thrall to the cult of the billionaire, still worshipping at the altar of wealth rather than challenging it. But I also feel what COP26 is showing, and we don't know, as Paul said, where it will end, and we hope it will lead to a good outcome this weekend. But the difficulty in making progress, I think, is the product of a decade of narrow nationalistic politics around the world, where people have been building walls, not bridges, where people have been playing to their domestic political agendas, and that has left the world in a position where it is finding it harder to make progress on the common issues that affect all humanity, and that should worry us all. And even during COP, we've had a situation where Westminster has been consumed by a crisis of sleaze. These politicians who are being accused have been making millions, but they're the same politicians who posed as the friends of ordinary people. Politicians on the right, we see them all over the world, don't we? They pose as the friend of working class people. But actually, they've been laughing in their face, making millions. And sadly, the focus of Britain has not been where it needs to be at this time. My point is, this type of politics won't rebuild the world after the pandemic. This type of politics will not get us to net zero anytime soon, but it will never get us to net zero in a just and a fair way. So that's why we do need change. And I can say in Britain, we have lived for too long under the myth that the market will solve everything. It was never true in the past, and it's not true now. We've been left in a position in Britain where during the pandemic, workers couldn't stop working even when they were ill because they wouldn't be paid. That is where deregulation and the myth of the market takes you. That included care workers in care homes. They couldn't stop working even though they were ill. Deregulation and the myth of the market has taken us to a position in Britain where people can't afford to use public transport, trains and buses, something as simple as that. And when you have a situation in Britain, as we do, where it costs less to catch a plane than it does to catch a train, and when it costs less to get a taxi for 3 people than it does to catch a bus, you know the economics of transport are in the fundamentally wrong place to even begin to try to tackle climate change. But we need a great reset, and we need it in Britain. Too. We do need a shift towards well-being of all being our guiding principle, where safe, good housing is a human right enshrined in law, where self-secure, fairly paid work is a guarantee for all, where climate justice comes with social justice. I feel the left has been, if you like, licking our wounds for too long. We need to show more courage. We need to rise up because our people depend upon it. They need us to step forward and show that we have the ideas to win elections. And we need to win elections. We can have the best ideas in the world, but if we don't go out there and communicate them, then our ideas will not change lives of people. So we need to stand forward now. Have courage, take inspiration from history. History can show us where we've had financial crashes, 2008, 1929. The right has advanced after those events because they've played the politics of fear, of division, scapegoating people, and that's happened again this time. But after humanitarian crises, history also shows us that people look at the world with new eyes. People look to the left. So just as the British left rebuilt Britain after the Second World War, I think the left in Britain and across Europe now has an opportunity to rebuild the world after the pandemic because people are looking at us afresh, and we've seen the success of our friends in Spain. We, of course, have seen the success of the Democrats in the United States. We've seen the Labour Party in Norway win and take power. We have hopes, of course, that Olaf Scholz will take power in Germany. And I come to my final point. we absolutely must ensure that it is Hidalgo in France we must ensure and rally to the cause of Hidalgo for France, already a world leader on climate, already showing in this great city where we are all gathered how climate justice can bring social justice at the same time. A person of great humanity, great humility, someone who brings light and hope in this dark world, and somebody who I'm here to say I will be supporting avec tout mon cœur. Thank you very much.
So, a few questions. It's difficult to see from here, but can I see any hands there? So you'll find there's a microphone going around. Here we go. Right. Try and be brief, please. So a very quick question on the current situation, talking about ecology, of course, and what's happening in Poland, for example, with the Belarusian immigration problem. We know that Europe is absent from this crisis. What is our role? What can we do given this humanitarian crisis? It's a serious situation, and I'm concerned about that. Thank you very much. So let's take another few questions before we can have a number of answers. We're going to have to finish this. We've got about half an hour now. So thank you very much for organizing this and everything that's been done by the group and all the work they've undertaken in general. So I'd like to talk about aid for development, notably with regard to African foreign aid to deal with climate issues, for which they're the main crisis. So what do you think can be done at the European level in that respect? So microphone, here we go. Let's see. Hello, I'm Javier Branchik. I'm a socialist and local politician. So at the end of the 19th century, we developed socialism that could create a balance between labor and capital. So we've tried to give more and more rights towards workers and the labor movement, thanks to the social movement, etc. So in the 20th century, we've gained new rights, but there have been major new developments recently which have undercut this model. First of all, globalization. With globalization, we've seen that capital can move around easily, so capital can never be quite grasped in one corner of the world. So if you tax too much in one corner, it will escape to some other place. The second major shock has been the climate ecological challenge, in which case we don't know how to meet with these challenges in ecological terms with the social aspects. So these two major shocks, globalization and the climate challenge, and how do we create hierarchy between social issues, fight against inequalities, and the environmental issues. So if there were clear answers, if we wouldn't have two candidates, one who's dealing with social and one who's doing ecological issues, we need to combine, in my view, the left and the ecologists, the Greens. So can you give a quick answer, and then we can take a few more questions? So on the last question, I'd like to say that, first of all, globalization is not a recent issue. This has existed for some time, for a long time, in fact, since the end of the end of 19th century, when we recreate the social state, so to speak. We've seen the first globalization between 96 and 14, when you had Keynes talking about economic consequences of peace, that an inhabitant in London can literally have can receive anything he wants. He can order produce from all around the world, and this was a sort of indication of what we can refer to now as the digital revolution. So globalization, in fact, was clearly present at the very time when we talked about the social protections, and we created these social protections in order to combat this issue of globalization. So when we talk about a shock of globalization at present, so there are two ways of dealing with this. The first is protectionism, and the second is the welfare state. So the welfare state is trying to amortize these shocks and to deal with volatile revenue linked with globalization. So the welfare state has been a major development which has ensured that inequalities have been reduced and to increase levels of education and major progress in terms of health. This is not a new issue, so we need to... And on the second issue, and can the left and the Greens be aligned? If we take a basic issue, so we now have to face one particular crisis, for example, that's clear. This is the energy precariousness with the erratic fuel prices. So you have fossil fuels erratic, which means that there's people are undermined on the social level. So the purchasing power crisis, driven by the increased fuel prices, is not driven by ecological issues. So we're not dealing about an ecological transition. We're dealing with, on the contrary, that is due to erratic energy prices, and many people in the world are trapped by this energy prices. This means that there is no clear opposition between the social and ecological issues. There are new social inequalities which are environmental origin, and access to energy is one of these new inequalities. So we don't just need to deal with this in terms of short-term messages or distribution of money. And we need to deal with this by energy innovation to free up hundreds of millions of people from erratic fossil fuel prices, to preserve their health and their purchasing power. We need to recognize that social inequalities are clearly connected with environmental issues, and this is what we try to deal with in the report, of course. Any other comments here at all?
To comment also on this last question first. In Germany, we try now to form a joint government between the Social Democrats and the Greens, which already shows there is common ground. Unfortunately, we both together don't have an overall majority. So another coalition partner has to join, which will probably be the Liberals. And that makes it much more difficult to find compromises. And it shows that the fight is not over. We have to fight for more majorities and higher majorities for the Socialists, Social Democrats, and the Greens in order really to introduce the change we need. And there is common ground, we have heard it. Social policy and ecological policy are intertwined. And we must do both at the same time. We cannot increase the price on carbon emissions without stabilizing at the same time the purchasing power of ordinary households. We have to have redistribution schemes at the same time there so that people can go with a decent income into these times of change, and without the fear of losing income, without the fear of losing a decent job. They may change their job, but they should not lose their possibility to earn a decent income. That's our responsibility to ensure that, and that's certainly difficult, but we have to do it or we will fail. Let me answer the first question too on migration policy, because this is also a truly European issue in my view. We have to find a common European migration policy and a common European approach to migration policy. And part of that approach must be legal immigration to Europe. Only then we can channel the migration process. Only then we can avoid that people die in the Mediterranean, die at the border of Poland now in Eastern Europe, which is inhuman as it is. And that certainly should be avoided and should be one of the utmost priorities now to ensure that we have a common immigration policy in Europe which saves life.
Yeah, a couple of points about migration. Of course, we are very concentrated on external migration, which means from North Africa and other parties to Europe. But because of climate change, we will have internal migration within Europe. And we, so far, have not really thought about this in terms, for example, of availability of new houses and new opportunities, because climate change will change people's life and preferences from the south to the north, and not necessarily only in this way. This is just to say that social and climate crisis must go hand in hand, and we are not yet there. And the second remark is about an institutional problem. And I think that the Social Democrats have to clarify their position on that. The European Commission was not built to manage crisis. It was built to harmonize legislation and so on in the long term. Do we want that the Commission becomes more a crisis manager or not? If yes, of course, we have to provide funds, but also a completely different mindset and decision-making rules. Over the last few years, we have seen, especially with the COVID, but now also with the energy prices and the migration and so on and so forth, a request to have more European policies, correctly. But from an institutional point of view, let me underline that the current institutional governance system of the European Union is not set for that. So I think that this is a very important position that they will be discussed in future, and is important also because this is coherent also with the responsibilities of different politicians. For example, the way in which fiscal policies are decided at EU level with the unanimity principle, if you wish, for taxes and so on. So these are very tough issues, I understand, but if we want to go ahead with this approach, these issues have to be addressed at least propose solutions.
Paul?
Oui, seulement...
Yes. I've got two comments on the question. How can we strike the right balance between labor and capital if we combine both? Environment. Now, I think that the response is right here in the book. The major shift. What you should realize is that the domestic market in the EU is the biggest market in the world. But we haven't tapped into this market to further our objectives. We can start thinking, why cannot we have a legislation on this market? And this is precisely why we have a proposal in the report, number one proposal, to have a legislation on responsible capitalism. So in the future, you need to...
They cannot anymore act just under capitalism, mind your own business, mind your own profit, mind it as quick as possible. Now the European Union is coming and saying, If you want to dance at the market in the European Union, you have to make a beautiful dance where people are there, where environment are there, where kids are there, where education are there, and you, the capitalist who's using the market, have now to behave on these conditions we're just defining. So, la grande transformation.
So the major shift is actually a tool. It's actually get the market to adapt to our conditions, and this is exactly what we need to do, ladies and gentlemen. And it's really not difficult if we actually have the will, if we actually say it. Thank you. So we're going to take a last round of questions. There's a revolving mic in the room. I would like to ask a question to my German colleague here. It's on the issue of nuclear power. Now, this is the context. Angela Merkel's government, the Austrian right, do not want nuclear energy as part of the future energy. So France will be deprived of European funds to innovate in the field of nuclear energy. Now, the second context, there is a nuclear future, there is innovation. Now, there are two things. The fourth generation nuclear stations that use nuclear waste, and nuclear waste coming from, not from nuclear energy coming from fission and not fusion. Now, nuclear energy is decarbonized energy and it's not very expensive. So will Germany support France? And I'm just going to end by saying that the Americans are investing in this energy. Bill Gates and GAFA, in fact, are investing in the fourth generation nuclear reactors and nuclear power stations. And there is a West American startup, I forgot the name. This startup has actually caught up with the delay in the potential benefits that nuclear fusion has to offer. Yes, another question, please. Thank you for this. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the panelists in this room. First of all, let me congratulate Anne Hidalgo for running the French presidential elections. I'm saying that one part of the world has been completely forgotten and sidetracked. It's Africa. What will you do to bring this population on board? They have no access to energy, no access to health, and who are in the thralls of dictators and multinationals. Thank you so much. So we're going to take a last question, a last intervention. My name is Dalma Habit, and I'm in charge of Union Patriotique. Now, I am really pleased to be with you. My question is talking about this development. Now, is this development that you're talking about is different from a world where well-being would be the cause? We are with Anne Hidalgo, by the way. Thank you.
Qui souhaite peut-être répondre?
Who would like to reply on the growth, for instance? Gustav, would you like to go?
Well, there's a special question posed to me on the German approach to nuclear power. Let me explain it a little bit. In Germany, the last atomic reactor will go down next year. So we will end the production of energy by nuclear power in very short time. The reason for this is certainly that we have made calculations also about the dangers of atomic power, not just the technical security, but also the security for a society. What kind of society you need in order to make a safe approach to use nuclear energy, because it's a very dangerous material. We know that. We know that from an international context. The agreement with Iran, for example, is based on the assumption, the right assumption, that nuclear power is a dangerous material. And given all that, the German approach is that this technology is, in all respects, not just technical, but for a society, too unsafe to be used in the future. Renewable energy, on the other hand, is more cheaply and more readily available. There's research going on to improve nuclear power, admit that, and this research should go on. It should be in a competition to the present supply of energy all the time, but given the state of the art, we say that renewable energies are preferable to nuclear power, and that will be also the approach from the future German government, I would say so. But there was another question on Africa, which is very important. How can we deal with Africa in this context of change? A continent which definitely has not enough resources to do all the investment which is needed also for Africa to change energy supply to fight the climate change. And there's one approach also in Germany. The future German government and also the present German government has made bilateral agreements already, or is doing bilateral agreements, for example, with South Africa, to give them technologies, to give them support, to transfer know-how, how to change energy supply in this continent. I think we should expand that on a European level so that the EU can make bilateral agreements with African countries to support them. They cannot do it with their own means. They're too small. But it is definitely needed. At the moment, it is much more cheaper for these countries to exploit not sustainable technologies, and we have to change that, and we have to support them for that. And this is another European challenge we have.
Sorry, I would like to answer a question that was not asked. In fact, it was asked in an indirect way, but I'm just going to spell out the question. Why is it meaningful for Europe? And I really would like to tell you what's in the report. The report is based on the assumption that Europe should be a well-being power. What does that mean, a well-being power? When we look at the world today, we've got three powers, three mainstream powers. You've got China, and it's quite obvious what China wants. They want political control. Over and above economic growth, we understand that China is building a model of absolute political control on freedom, and it's using capitalism and digital tools to have absolute control on existence. This is one model possible, political control. So it's communism and digital technology and the totalitarian digital nightmare. Now the US has chosen economic growth. Now, Europeans invented well-being and social protection, and the US invented GDP. And they basically have GDP indicators to explain growth. And now what does Europe want? Now, the assumption that the report is making in the end, and we talked about this with Marcel Mersch, Europe could make the choice of being a power in well-being. That means not only recognizing ecological considerations. Europe was one of the first countries to vote for carbon tax and sustainable development. This was enshrined in the European text. Now, let's come back to the origins of Europe. This is where we invented welfare state. It's the state of well-being. It's recognizing that human existence does not tantamount to survival. So making European a power of well-being is that. And I think the EU can spearhead this idea, can further this idea, and actually develop a new indicator, a new compass. And I'm basically counting on European governments. There are other governments who did it, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland. They've actually embarked upon this economy of well-being. And I think in Europe we need countries who can actually propose this new vision and spearhead it. So the European identity would have a more tangible meaning for citizens. It would be something else than a machine. So this is exactly what we need to commit and embark ourselves upon. Would you like to say something?
You asked what the progressive parties should do for Africa. Well, first of all, commit to stick to the UN targets of 0.7% of national income in terms of transfers to developing countries. As only very few countries, even in Europe, stick to this target. And this cannot be, let's say, forgotten, beside the way in which the money is given and so on. But this is something that was taken years ago by rich countries, and I think that Europe should stick to that. I understand that it's not an easy thing to sell, but you see, our ministry is also in charge of a coastal guard. Our people save, rescue thousands of people, and from time to time I get messages in the middle of the night about operations or pictures and films about what's going on. This is not acceptable, not only in the Mediterranean Sea, but also as what we are seeing around us. And this will not disappear unless we do something very seriously. And the second point is about the issue of degrowth. Well, if you stick to GDP, of course, limits of growth, like the famous book 1972 of the Club Rome that convinced me to become an economist, it's apply. But if you shift to well-being, why should we cut down our well-being? Walking in the streets doesn't increase GDP, but increases well-being, especially if you are in a clean air. What I'm just trying to say is that the type of change that we envisage, also because of environmental limits, by definition, cut down GDP. Therefore, it's not a good idea anyway to keep using this indicator that doesn't tell you what you should know, but on top will decline only because we change our habits.
Merci beaucoup.
Right. Thank you for this very lively discussion. We're going to continue with the second panel discussion, but before that, I think Eric should give a 3-minute short and sweet conclusion. Not conclude, because it's actually opening up. Now, I just wanted to react to what the panelists said, and the question we're going to ask you is, imagine that you would have to actually ask 2 questions to yourselves. So first of all, are you going to campaign for Anne Hidalgo? Yes, that's clear. The second question is, imagine a second that the society is concerned with the well-being of the public. You have the answer to this question, and all the answers is basically in the report that was presented. Please read it. go through it, please don't read. Let it not be a bedtime read. I'm not saying that's going to be the Holy Grail. Let it be a reference book, deep dive into the socio-democratic thought. And once you've actually acquired the taste, you will not be able to live without it, because everything that's said is right. And there are questions on governance. There's a major governance problem at the European level. There is a major governance problem at the world level. But let us not leave these questions on the side. If you want to change the European governance, you really need to basically further our values that have been presented in the report. And if you really want to have a new world governance system, you need a strong European Union that will basically be in the service of the internal markets. That is important, but there are many other questions as well at the international horizons. The pandemic, the climate, migration, and that is the stake of the future. And the EU must be spearheading this in the world if we really want to rise up to the challenges of social justice. And this, as socialists, is our battle to wage. Thank you so much.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is going to be the transition with the next panel discussion. There's going to be a video on the presentation of the ICSE report by the Socio-Democrats at the European Parliament.
What is at stake now is that a lot of crises are following each other in a very, very tight manner. We have not seen that before. We have a financial crisis, a economic growth crisis with massive unemployment, a inequality crisis. We had the famous or unfamous climate crisis with a lot of effects. Crisis follow crisis in a very tense way. This is not a coincidence. The major crisis is the global capitalism, which will make our situation, per definition and with a frightening logic, worse and worse year by year. And if we don't change very dramatically, we are risking that my generation's grandchildren, they will have a poorer life.
L'approche sociale écologique, c'est tout simplement l'idée que les questions environnementales sont essentiellement des questions sociales. Si vous prenez
If you look at the question of ecological crisis, the biggest one, it's climate change. You see, the 10% of the world population is responsible for 50% of greenhouse gases. In Europe, you have the richest households that have 150, 180 tons of carbon footprint, whilst the average is at 6, 7, or 8. So we have absolutely no doubt that you've got greenhouse emissions that are dependent on the level of income. So this is precisely why you've got these stark inequalities. And you know that for the poorest households, energy is actually a greater part of their budget. So you can actually see the two effects here. You've got the richest households that are polluting the most, and the poorest households that are actually struck by the energy prices and the climate change impact. So this is what ecology is all about. We really have to link ecology with societal questions, and the solution to these ecological crises is basically social.
Nous ne pouvons pas laisser les effets du changement.
We cannot allow the effects of climate change strike the weakest ones. These extreme weather events will multiply. We need to have a public insurance that's going to be like a national insurance in order to basically coordinate different risk pooling systems. We really have to make sure that energy access is a fundamental social right. We also need to align political objectives of the Common Agricultural Policy with the climate agriculture. Agriculture and forest industry are responsible for more than 30% of greenhouse effects at the world level. We know that, and a healthy agriculture is actually great for human health and the planet. Good food should be accessible by one and all, and it is possible, and we are convinced. It is also obvious that biodiversity and ecosystems are really important for life, and this is precisely why we demand the European Commission on the constraining biodiversity legislation with the same degree of constraint as the climate law. And it's the same thing to combat, it's important to combat climate change at the same time.
On individual level, it is what I call the insecurity of livelihood, the insecurity of jobs, insecurity of sources of income. On societal level, it is the cuts to social spending. The public services are under threat. For the sake of remaining competitive in the global rush for profits, our government cuts both social spending and reduce job security, increasing the pressures on everybody in society. But even if we become very equal and very rich, if our healthcare system is underfunded or is completely trapped in considerations of profit, we will all be extremely vulnerable because we would not have secure access to quality healthcare. These are the drivers of precarity nowadays.
Proponemos varias medidas. Una estrategia para acabar con el empleo precario. En ella deben comprometerse todos los gobiernos de la Unión. Los falsos autónomos son inaceptables. Queremos una garantía de empleo sostenible que funcione como la garantía juvenil, pero para los desempleados de larga duración. Deben tener programas públicos para mejorar su formación, para adaptarse a las nuevas oportunidades. También queremos una ley europea contra la pobreza, que tenga objetivos jurídicamente vinculantes. Es posible acabar con la pobreza en Europa de aquí al 2050. Claro, todo esto cuesta dinero, pero también...
So we need to avoid tax evasion, etc., tax avoidance. Perhaps we need a tax on large fortunes. Same could apply. We could perhaps gain 500 billion from this.
Greedy capitalism. It will only make the richer even more rich. And listen, they are rich enough, if I can't say. 1% of the population own 44% of all wealth in the world. Do I need to argue more about stopping this development?
Me parece que merece.
So it's really worth sharing your wealth in order to improve the life of the majority. Finally, solidarity and a more cohesive society will be beneficial for one and all.
If you say it's okay, I don't mind. Take your time. You won't have to wait, the wait is over. 'Cause it's all I ever really longed for. 'Cause everything is alright, right. You and I will be alright, right. For a while we were down, but at last now we found what we always knew, but still we wonder. Now we don't have to wait any longer.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous, on va vous demander de vous rasseoir pour la seconde partie.
So I'd like you to take your chairs, please, for the second discussion. So the second round table panel discussion Sustainable Wellbeing Fall, and Laurence Tobiano is going to chair this. So please take a seat, and please give a clap for Olivier Faure, First Secretary of the French Socialist Party. So, hello everybody. I'm delighted to see you all here today at the Mutuality Building. Suddenly an historic place, because we're here during a term just after a French holiday, and we're here for a very good reason. We are both European and socialist. And each of those words of greatest importance. If Jaurès was here, for example, what would he say? No doubt that what is said in the report in the Republic on Socialism, he would say that without the EU, socialism lacks power. Excuse me. Without socialism, European Union is empty, an empty vessel. There's no doubt that he was thinking of governance, but he would also share a clear point of view. Without Europe, we would not be able to face the challenges ahead. Without the cumulative power of partner nations, without their determination to make progress and not fighting each other, we would not. We would not be able to deal with the issues ahead. It's the 12th of November today, the day after, let's say, the day after the armistice. We renovated the situation after the war that caused such damage throughout the continent. So with 1 century behind us to reflect on the situation, we know that this peace is still fragile. There's no definitive victory in history. There's just the determination to move forward. Unhappy peoples, let's say, people who are left to one side, are not being faced with a clear prospect forward. Without a prospect, peoples are retreating into their own square ground, so to speak, and feel excluded. And so, without socialism, Europe is void. Liberal philosophy cannot make up for these problems. It implies the abandonment of the weakest, and dumping, competition is their hallmark, and not cooperation. And it is this model today which is now facing a crisis. It's the liberal economy which has led to relocation of economic produce beyond our frontiers. It's this globalization, this liberal globalization, which has increased the carbon footprint and accelerated global warming. And the health crisis has raised the reasons why we are fighting or combating to deal with inequalities and to ensure solidarity, to ensure that public services are at a sufficient level. And women and men need to be backed in this respect as well. So not just for profit. So what will Europe look like in the future? There are increased inequalities between the rich and the poor and rich countries. The liberal economies are just dealing with their own issues. Europe is struggling to make its footprint clear throughout the world, and the continent is now nonetheless the most committed to these ends. So the Russian chiefs in Belarus are seeking to undermine the EU by using immigrants or possible immigrants to their own ends. So we have a clear responsibility. So what other family of thought, let's say, what party can meet these challenges? The extreme right deals with populism, just speaks of combating immigrants and immigration. But these inequalities are surging forward. And given the climatic challenge, and we will not only have to deal with waves, but a tsunami of immigrants. Since the right refers to the past, where is the only single voice to be found? And they will only deal with hunger, war, health, etc. And this will force people to emigrate, and nobody will be able to resist this force. The neoliberals are solely focused on the market. In the COVID crisis in France, it's not even finished when reference is regarded the solutions laid with reducing the unemployment benefits, for example, to increasing poverty, notably for the young, for those without degrees, for example. There's no real value given to these people. Decent salaries are not on the map for these people, and social protection is left to one side. On the far left, we see that they're more concerned with dealing with combating the social democrats rather than the extreme right. As for the Greens, they're focused on exclusive ecological focus, not dealing with the real social challenges as well, the economic and democratic and scientific and security issues. So we need to be responsible and ensure this great shift. It's our responsibility to deal with this. So in the European Parliament, under your force, and Arachi, who's left off with Anne just now, just for the moment. So I'm just making up for their absence, let's say. Eric, of course, and on behalf of the Commission, the European title, the Commission for the Sustainable Development, headed by Teresa and Paul, we have a major contribution and the only people to lay a pathway for sustainable development. Well-being must be the starting point for all our countries so that we can reinvest socialist policy common to all European peoples. I hope that this text I don't recognize your mask. I hope that this text will be debated by all our partners in the PASE. It certainly will be the case in France, and we're particularly in tune with this work. And in time for the socialists, for the presidents, to live better, and so as not to lose ground. And this is what we are dealing with at Glasgow at the moment. We know within the end of the century, we face a dark future unless we take action. The future of humanity in some areas is under threat. 4 billions are under threat from the climate developments in the last century. Given the recent information from the GEC and Antonio Guterres at UN, we've seen that at the end of the G20 at Rome and at Glasgow, we see that they've indicated that we are facing climate catastrophe. We face a dark future. And despite the merits of the Paris Agreement, we did not manage to develop sufficient momentum in order to pave the way for a decarbonized future. So the clock is ticking, and the situation is too fluid. The richest states have not fulfilled to provide their commitment to provide 100 billion for the poorer countries, 0.1% of world GDP. And as for the agreements, a lot of them is in terms of loans and not subsidies, which has just increased the debt levels of the benefiting countries. So it is time that we're taking clear cross-border transversal effort to create a possibility for the future. And this great shift, this major shift, we've given the main guidelines for this. We want to move from a broken world to one of sustainable well-being. And in your first report 3 years ago, you already provided some fodder for our European campaign, and the French Socialist Party also took note of some of the comments made in this first report. And this was reflected in our attitude to the first confinement. And this has formed the base for our electoral measures for 2022. So we need to inject new energy for this ecological translation and in the combat against poverty and inequality. Our political family in the last few years has made a qualitative leap forward in the creation of a social state, which will leave nobody on the sidelines from this shift. I know some people have questions as to the efficiency or the efficacy of this report. I know that libraries in parliaments and militants all around the world there's a whole string of reports that people no longer to refer to after a period of time. But this time they're wrong. They are not. The Europeans must work together to develop a joint project. We, the Socialists, are perhaps the only group who are working to this end to create a new positive project. And we're not dealing with just creating national opposing positions. We're seeking to, we can refer to the Green Deal at the Commission, for example, the pooling of European debt, for example. Our weight here in the European Parliament has been of great importance and led to these developments. And our representatives throughout Europe, especially the mayor in Greater Manchester, for example, or the mayors in Europe who are also working towards greater innovation throughout France. For example, if we look at the backing that Anne Hidalgo has found in France, there is a great deal more to achieve, of course. And in terms of social developments, but we're ready and we're committed to achieving our aims. To implement the 242 proposals in the report, the quickest way to do this is to ensure that the Social Democrats have a victorious throughout Europe. So with the Finnish and Danish, Swedish governments, for example, we've seen what's happened in the elections there. Also in Germany, we can see the same thing with the victory that was unexpected of Olaf Scholz there, as an example of this, with his victory with the SPD. And the Germans are now working towards a coalition under the SPD. And of course, not just because they're about to arrive, but because it's the truth. The sun, let's say, is rising for the left, and it's risen in the south. So thank you for Perez, etc., for having raised our hopes and for contributing to our efforts here and creating sufficient enthusiasm to development forward and throughout Europe. For those who are still wondering whether the left and the right are the same, I can make some clear points. The Socialist Party in Spain and Portugal has given a minimum wage increase of a minimum of 23%. The indexation of pensions to inflation in Spain, the limitation to rents, combat against limiting increases in electricity. In Portugal, the end of the austerity program while halving the public deficit. In Spain, in this government, which has more women than men, 1 billion euros has been spent on reducing inequalities and violence against women. Here we have clear examples, and I could give you many more. So now we have to show that the socialists lead the way forward in France, and then we have a new way forward, and the carbon neutrality and sustainable development and regeneration of democracy within France. In France, there is one woman who is leading this combat. She indeed comes from the south as well. She is courageous and has clear convictions and is not just committed to her own personal ambition. She's not just seeking to please. She wants to act and not just speak. And her name, of course, is Anne Hidalgo, and it's with her that all our hopes lie. So I ask her to applaud her. And here we have the leader of the French Socialist Party. Thank you very much, Olivier. Now, a warm welcome for Sergei Stanishev, President of the PES.
A great opportunity to be in Paris. We are here to discuss, of course, the well-being concept and how do we get there. And I think it's the right place and the right time to discuss this crucial issue for our family, and I believe for the citizens of our countries. Firstly, because Paris has chosen a mayor who has initiated a real social and environmental transformation, and who pioneered the concept of the 15-minute city, which was then followed by many other cities around Europe. Secondly, because Parti Socialist, under the leadership of Olivier Faure, showed the strength of the leadership of the ideas with the concept Il est temps de vivre mieux. I think it's really crucial, important, and it's a very good example for other parties from our family. Last but not least, because the 2022 elections are getting closer. And we are, of course, here because we are very proud to have Anne as candidate. And I would like to say that together with Parti Socialist, Anne is holding proudly high the colors of our family, the colors of social justice and environmental sustainability. So we are living in a world which is rapidly changing under the pressure simultaneously of a number of crises, economic, social, and many others, and under a new technological revolution. This creates new strains and inequalities in our societies. We all see that the current generations feel that they have worse prospects than their parents. We can see that the climate change is still looming without adequate response from many countries around the world. And we can see that globalization, demographic change, the digital transition, they can only be met with a common societal effort in order to tackle them, to humanize them. And here we come to the role of the social democratic and progressive family. Nobody else but us can address these challenges. Otherwise, the beautiful promise of the European Union, which was valid for decades, promising a better future, will fail. And then we can see monsters rising and challenging democracy, creating populist movements and many other risks. This is our responsibility to address the challenges, and nobody else can do it better than us. Because Paul Nierop remembers the first years after the 2008 crisis. What a fight it was against austerity. But they prevailed then. The conservatives, the neoliberals. Now things are shifting and changing. And I'm very grateful to Paul Nierop and to Teresa and the whole team who was working on this very impressive and in-depth Great Shift report for the work they have been doing in the last years. Because it's not an effort of several months. Our progressive family is working on sustainable development approaches and techniques even for many years. Before the European elections of 2019, this is when this work was launched and started, and step by step it was gaining momentum, even broader expertise, and coming to very precise decisions. And when we talk about well-being, very often citizens may ask what actually it is about. We should always remember that well-being may sometimes be a word which is not very well understood, but I think it is based on the same values which were valid for our family since its existence. This is why I would like to remind and quote at this moment here with the formula for socialism provided as an outline by Léon Blum in the first half of the 20th century, who said, maintenir et développer les droits de personnes humaines au sein d'une société.
So in a European society based on a collective good, and this is the basic formula of socialism, collective good.
Today as well. And of course, for us, well-being means many concrete things. It's not just a slogan on the wall. It's very precise. It means good working conditions and work-life balance, because in the end, we must serve the good life of our citizens, and the work should not be the other way around. It needs strong welfare and health systems which will accompany every individual through the whole of their lives. And we saw in the last couple of years of the COVID crisis how crucial it is for each one of the citizens. And I think that also there is one very substantial shift. For many years and decades, people were thinking that many elements were taken for granted. But actually, it was seen during the COVID crisis that the austerity policies, the neoliberal policies, undermined these rights. They undermined the quality and accessibility of healthcare, of education. And I think this is the reason why there is much more willingness to listen to our words and our proposals. And we should avail of this opportunity. For us, well-being means also public services which are the capital of those who have none. And Paris is a good example with public construction which has been doing here under the leadership of Anne Hidalgo. Strong public education and flourishing cultural sector, they're also essential for our political family and for our understanding of well-being, as well as proactive distribution of wealth, because equality is in our DNA. I outlined just some of the key elements of our understanding of well-being and what we shall be fighting for in the next years and probably decades, because it's a long process. But it is also important now to stress, how do we get there? Because there is no magic trick which will bring us from the current state of play in Europe, in France, in every country, towards a well-being society in a developed extensive mode. The important thing is to understand that it will be a prolonged fight, and it will be a fight, because we have a great report here with very precise policies written, but they will not be given to the workers or to the citizens or to our family without a political fight. Each achievement in our movement in the last century and a half have come through political fight. Otherwise, we would not be relevant. And I can say that we don't start from scratch. We don't start from zero. On the contrary, we have pushed in the last years for adequate minimum wages across Europe, and it has been proven by a number of socialist governments, as in Spain, in Portugal, that we can deliver on this, and by German friends as well. The 2015 Paris Agreement gave birth to the new Green Deal, which is now a flagship priority campaign for the socialist family in general. And we have to keep Europe as the key player globally against climate change, because what we are doing through the new legislation, green legislation in Europe, is remarkable. But also, there is something else which is vital for our political family. It's only us who can provide that this green transition may be just. We cannot leave any person abandoned or losing from this. And this will require really a serious political effort on our side and serious resources, public resources, which will provide the possibility this transition not to become painful for our citizens and not to lose them on the way. We have achieved the pillar of social rights in Europe as a renewed EU commitment for social justice. And I think this is a great thing done exactly by our family. And last but not least, the European Recovery Fund. It was impossible to think, I can see also Pedro Sanchez coming in together with Antonio Costa, Anne Hidalgo, Irache, the leader of our group in the S&D. Welcome all. It's great to see all of you together in solidarity, supporting Anne and supporting the work which our family is doing on well-being, on sustainable development, both environmental and social. So I was talking about that we do not start from scratch our fight for well-being and for sustainable development. And the last thing which I was underlining now was about the Recovery Fund. I would like to thank all the members of our family, our prime ministers in the Council, our group in the European Parliament, because, dear friends, without us, the Recovery Fund would not be there. And if it would be there, it would be much smaller and it would be with less tools available. We, in a way, revolutionized the European Union, led by our compass of sustainable development and of well-being and of justice and fairness. This is what socialism is about. So I would like to thank, again, Paul and Teresa for this wonderful report. It's a great food for thought, but also a great food for fight. Let's do it together, and let's really follow this principle that it's time to live better now, as the French socialists are saying. Thank you very much. All the best to you.
Good evening.
Ça va aller, ça va aller. Ben, j'ai quitté Teresa Ribera il y a...
I just left Teresa Ribera a few hours ago. We were together in Glasgow for the end of these really tough negotiations, which will put us back on track. And ever since the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, we've been out of track. So I'm really glad to be here. I'm very honored to be here and talk about this report and to see what you're going to do with this report in Europe, because we know that this major shift is right at our doorstep. Decarbonized society is a society with a new social contract, and the report speaks about this. And this is the first time we have this report in Europe by you, by all the MEPs who basically have defined the mandate of the New Deal. I'm really honored to invite Pedro Sanchez, Anne Hidalgo, and Antonio Costa and ask them to express their views on the subject.
Bien.
Right. We don't have a lot of time. We've got 30 minutes so that you can actually tell us everything you do, everything you're going to do, and what must be done in Europe. Obviously, the first question is about the vulnerabilities of climate change and the environmental crisis. It basically is affecting regions where you're in charge. My first question, social ecology for you, and I'm going to start with Antonio Costa. What do you do? How did Portugal deal with this? There's so many things to say. Obviously, we know there's nature preservation, fossil fuels, and Pedro Sanchez. I must tell you that Teresa Ribera is like my sister, and I know what she's doing with Pedro. And Anne Hidalgo is in Paris, and she's been there for quite some time, and she's put actually the environmental issues at the very core of her agenda. Now, I really would like to have your take on international projects and European projects. We really need to take this away, not just to Brussels, but also to Madrid and to each country. And first of all, what are you doing? How have you put ecology at the core of the social project? Because this is actually a novelty for the socialist family. I've been a supporter for quite some time. When I was there with Lionel Jospin, ecology was not really on the top of the agenda. Antonio, you've been a promoter of this political family, so please take the floor. Can I speak in French? Yes. Thank you for this invitation. For me, it's an immense pleasure to be here with Pedro, with Anne Hidalgo, and the President of the Government of Spain, and Madam President. Right. So we need to promote this major shift and also rise to the challenges brought by this major shift. And this is precisely why I think social democracy is in the best position to understand all this. We really need to put this on a pedestal, on a very strong pedestal, to rise to the challenges of the digital technology, automation, and climate change is a difficult transition, and we really need to basically deal with this. We really need to be honest with the citizens. Change is expensive. Changes would create problem. There are activities that will cease to exist. And this is precisely why we really need a strong social pedestal to ensure that there are new opportunities in life so that no one is basically sidelined. Secondly, we also need to infuse trust into entrepreneurs. They have the capacity to do this and retain their competitive edge. We also need strong social protection policies so that no one is left out. And this is why during the Portuguese presidency of the EU, we organized the Porto Summit. For the very first time, we obtained an agreement, a tripartite agreement with the European trade unions and the platform, the social platform, and also the President of the European Parliament and the President of the European Council, the President of the Commission signed an interinstitutional agreement to implement the action plan on the European Social Rights Charter, and this is extremely important. Second thing, as Sergei just said, we have had a revolution in the EU over the past 2 years, and this was the drafting for the very first time a financial plan that's comparable to the Marshall Plan, funded by the EU, and that's going to fund the next generation EU. And it's not just funding for the next generation, but it's also an investment for this major shift that we're going to experience in our lifetimes. Finally, we really need to step up the conditions in order to understand that we need to react to the cost of life. If we do not have popular support for this major shift, we're going to completely miss it out. We're going to further the populist agenda. And only Social Democrats are in a position to identify investments to strengthen the social Europe and also create conditions that are conducive for Europe to rise to the challenges, like price of fossil fuels. Pedro suggested that we should have a vaccination strategy and see how we can have just like the vaccination strategy, we should also have a common fossil fuel strategy in order to basically move to the electric cars. Now, there are other solutions. We really need to have an energy market at the European level. We also need to have better interconnection of the Iberian Peninsula, especially with France, might I add. But it's really important to understand that we need to commit. The people need to commit and be roped in this process of change. And this is not just about telling everyone on Friday saying that there is a climate threat, but in order to rise up to this challenge, we really need to address individual problems on a day-to-day basis, and we should make sure that people have the possibility to work and They need to keep themselves warm. They need to continue leading their lives. And this is precisely why it is really important to have a strong socialist family of social democrats within the council so that we can address these issues and not just put a halt to this this major shift. Do I have some more time? Yes, I do. Let me just leave you with a message. The future is not about stopping change. It's not actually coming back on your tracks, backtracking. A good example is what's happening in Portugal today. The price of fossil fuels is rising, but the price of electricity will decrease in January. Why? Because we've started investing heavily in the renewable energies 15 years ago. So 60% of our electricity is from renewable energy sources. And this is precisely why the prices of energy, of fossil fuels is on the rise, but the price of electricity is on the decrease. So you really need to step up investment in renewable energies and clean energies, because this is how, in the long term, we will have cheap energy and accessible energy for one and all. Thank you. And this is what needs to be done.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I will try and speak in French a little bit, but unfortunately I've actually lost the habit, but I understand French. First of all, thank you, dear friends from the French Socialist Party, from the European Socialist Party, and thank you, Anne. We really need France, a progressive France within the European Council. I am convinced that with Anne as President of the French Republic, we will basically further the cause.
To English, just to answer your questions. And a few remarks that will add to what Antonio said. Three ideas. The first one, I think, it's that, as Antonio said, renewable energies are not the problem or the cause and the origin of this rise of energy prices. I think it's the opposite. What we need is governments that are committed with this ecological transition, with a just ecological transition, and with a very strong investment on renewable energy. This is something that we started to do in Spain 3 years ago when I came to office. That is why we have already sometimes from 40 to 60% of our electricity on renewable energy, and we are committed to, to deploy and deliver an increased number of renewable energies. Second, I think that the example of Portugal and Spain in the Iberian Peninsula is I think it is inspiring us. Why? Because we consider this ecological transition as a big opportunity to reindustrialize not only Spain and Portugal, but also Europe. In the end, ecological transition and digitalization are interlinked. And what we are witnessing, at least in the Iberian Peninsula, is that we can create new opportunities in territories that before, with the last industrial revolution, they were apart and forget in this industrial revolution. So I think that this is a great opportunity not only for generations, for new works, new economy, but also for territories to localize new industry linked to the ecological transition and digitalization. And the reflection that I would, from my experience as Prime Minister, is that in these last 3 years, what we did was to close without any, I would say, social turbulence, but with social dialogue and social peace, most of our coal mines. And we did it because we considered and we designed this transition on a bottom-up basis. It is important to speak with municipalities. It is important to speak with workers. It is important to speak with citizens that live in these territories in order to say, look, we're going to change our way of producing energy, but we are going to offer new opportunities for the territory. And this, I think, it is essential, and this is why I believe that Social Democrats, we have an important role to play, because dialogue, agreements, listen to people, especially for the most vulnerable people. These are the, I would say the main attitudes and skills for social democrat government. So I think that I really believe that Europe is living a momentum. I think that Europe can lead the ecological transition, but it is important not only to lead the ecological transition, but to give a just and fair ecological transition. And in Portugal, they are delivering. In Spain, we are also in the way to deliver this very important goal. And I believe that next year we will have also a socialist president in the Republic in France, and we can do many things together.
Thank you, Pedro Sanchez. It's true that the transition you made on carbon mines is a model. We really did something very difficult. We had the municipalities and the trade unions on our side to pull out from the carbon technology, and that's great. And we look at this as an example. Anne, thank you, first of all. It's an immense pleasure for me to be here. I would like to thank the Social Democrat group in the European Parliament, Ireche, Eric, Sylvie, for having organized this meeting. Yeah, it's a pleasure and honor to be alongside two great presidents. I draw inspiration from them. I talk a lot about them. They support me. I've actually supported them in their political struggles. And I'm convinced that the solution lies with the Social Democrats and with Europe, because it's at this level that we can have enough weight against the US, which have pulled out of the Paris Agreement, Paris Agreement, also Russia and China. And we can really work with Africa. So this is where the solution lies, in the hands of social democrats. And what I can see that social democracy brings some kind of conviction against crisis. When you're faced with a crisis, you really need social support, social protection, because irrespective of the nature of the crisis, whether it's economic crisis or a diplomatic crisis, it's actually quite linked. You see, wars and economy are intrinsically linked, and we really need protection. We really need support to rebuild and anticipate. And social democrats lie here. This is my political family, and I really think they provide fair solutions, because when they see a crisis, they say, how can we, first of all, ensure that no one is at risk, and especially people who do not have any other solutions than ours. We really have to support them, and we have to act on their behalf. And I'm actually talking about the working class and the popular classes. So my convictions are fair, and we have geopolitical diplomatic consequences. And here again, socio-democrats have come at the right time of history, and they are looking for balanced policies. But these are ambitious policies. So finding a balance is quite ambitious, especially when great forces are at play who really do not want things to change because they want to continue exploiting the world the way they're doing it. These great forces are so powerful that they're often more powerful than the state, and the only power that can encounter them is the European power. I can also see in Antonio and Pedro's examples, and also in Denmark, and also in other countries, or very soon Germany with Olaf Scholz, what I can see is a method, and this method is something that we don't decide on our own. But here we can talk about who decides all alone. But I mean, a socio-democracy draws support from society. We should be working with trade unions. We shouldn't be weakening them in order to basically make the major shift from industrial society to a cleaner society. We need to discuss things with our trade unionists. Now, if they're scared of this change, and if we really need to bring them on board, we really need to have protective measures, social policies, and support policies in new jobs as well. This means that we need to be talking to the citizens. And this means that we should be working with the various stakeholders, like local municipalities, local authorities. If we do not bring them on board, we're going to deprive ourselves of the opportunity to change our infrastructure. For instance, the electric vehicle. I think there are two things that are very important. Of course, you really, all manufacturers and industrialists should be on board with this shift, and I hope by 2030, 2035 there will be no thermal vehicles. But for it to work, what do we need? We need to, first of all, ensure that popular classes can afford an electrical car. So we need policy support. We need to make sure that the population that cannot buy electric vehicles can do so in the future. And this means that there should be infrastructure to have electrical stands all over the place. And this cannot actually be done all alone in the top circles, completely cut off from the public. And this is actually done with at the local governments. And I think this method is a modern method. It's at a crucial moment in the history of our lands. You see, discussion is very difficult in French politics. The term of social democracy has been sidelined and contested even by the left wing in France. For me, this vision and this method is something that will allow us to act. It's not about just speaking and committing. It's all about acting on the change, acting on changing our societies. The report that was presented today, that only the Social-Democrats have actually drafted, because there's no such equivalent report drafted by other parliamentary groups of a different political color. This report basically analyzes the basis of this fair transformation, and I really think we're doing this at the right moment of history. We need to take ownership of this. The fact that I'm seeing you here gathered in such great numbers from foreign climes, and you who basically are inspirators of a European future, inspire France. And I'd really like to take the opportunity to thank you all. we really stretched for time. I really would like to talk to you about what we're going to do with this great European deal. So we all actually, towards the end of our stimulus grants, we're talking of budgetary austerity. So what do we do? So we're at the end of our stimulus packages. So what do you see? What's going to happen after this, in this phase where we have to have huge economic investments? We have to talk about the European financial stability on the green European launch and how to bring citizens on board. So what do we do now? So as of July, we've got the Green Deal. What do we do with the citizens, and what do we do with this huge macroeconomic challenge? Pedro, you can start off.
We cannot forget that we are having a big crisis with the pandemic yet, and we don't know when are we going to overcome this crisis. But it is certainly true that this crisis has accelerated many changes and revolutions, and of course the digital and ecological transitions are, the twin revolutions. So if we want to deliver as Europeans our goals on climate, it is certainly true that we will need not only private but also public investment. And for that, I think that in the debate that we are about to open in the Council and of course the Commission and the Parliament regarding the fiscal rules, we need to adapt our goals, our political goals on climate and digital to a new stability pact. And this is going to be a big debate, a very tough debate, but it's certainly true that if we want to deliver in climate and in digital, because of course this other revolution is so important and of course very disruptive for many generations, we need to reconsider and review our fiscal rules. Secondly, I do believe that what Antonio did in the Portuguese presidency of the European Union was so important. He mentioned the Oporto Summit. I think it's crucial that we align our economic semesters to the social dimension, because one of the biggest lessons of this pandemic is that there will be no more economic development without social cohesion and territorial cohesion. So therefore, it is important that we align the economic semester with the social dimension. My government in Spain, with the Belgian government, we launched a non-paper saying, well, okay, we need a social dimension procedure aligned with the economic semester. We have in the Parliament very important debates with the directive of minimum wage, which is so important for Social Democrats. Also on the labor rights for workers in the digital platforms. My government already, with an agreement with the with the business companies and the trade unions, we reached two important agreements. First, recognizing labor rights for workers on digital platforms, and secondly, recognizing rights for the teleworking area that we opened with this pandemic. And finally, I think that we will see what the Commission launch next year, but it will be very important to see how we launch this idea of a minimum income for reducing the social exclusion. Because in the end, I really like what Anne says about that the social democracy is like the left that reforms, that transforms, that allow societies to advance. And my experience is that we have a welfare state that protects in a better way the elderly ones than the youth. And it's important to review also the functioning of our welfare state in order to guarantee and strengthening the youth cohesion and reducing this breach of intergenerational breach that we have at least in Spain, and I believe in Europe. But in the end, I do believe that we need to to consider fairly as Europeans if we want to deliver on climate, on digital, in a just a transition on the ecological and digital. We will need to review our fiscal rules in order to adapt to these two major revolutions. And this is something that, well, we're going to open the debate in the Council, and that is why it's so important to have many Social Democrats governments in the Council. And that is why, and we wait you in the Council next year.
So, Anne, how do you see that citizens, as it were, the general people and the general public are going to be involved in this process? How's the general public going to be involved in the Green Deal? I think we need to create consensus on these issues. There's too much conflict, opposition between ecology and people's financial situation at the end of the month. A lot of people think that ecology is an enemy in a sense, and we have to deal with that. So we need to ensure discussion, and the politicians are actively engaged and who are committed to their point of view. For example, what's to do with the energy precariousness. So we need to invest in homes. So for people who face the energy problem, we need to be active in investing in the general public so that they're aware and consulted in terms of general transport, public transport. And consensus is difficult in France, for example. The head of the Paris region, who's also a candidate to be president here, has decided to ensure consultation against a road, against shared travel on the peripheral ring road in Paris. So there's still politicians then, people who are combating this, we still have to argue why it's necessary to combat global warming. So I've seen in your report that the main issue is, the key issue is how do we deal with global warming? So we need to promote electric car, public transport, and also combating what we called people who are too focused on their own individual cars. So we're still in its infancy in terms of political discussion. The media also is still focused on conflict. There shouldn't really be this conflict between the ecological and the social. It's vital to ensure that the general public is committed in this respect, and the unions and local associations must be involved in this. Local authorities are of great importance, and they are directly engaged with the general public. And once we ensure that practical policies are put in terms of renovating homes, for example, impacting the budgets of the local population, if we ensure this and we provide sufficient general discussion on these issues, then we will make some progress. So the general public has been engaged. I think we need to return to the local authorities to ensure that they engage meetings. And if I was elected president, for example, I would ensure that the president meets up with the local authorities. And they're the main or the big investors in this country. And there we would create consensus to ensure that there's a flow of investment from Europe at the national level and at the local level. There may be some differences between different regions. For example, in the southwest, they may focus on hydrogen. In other regions, they may focus more on on wood, for example, but we can use to adopt local policies, but organize local discussions and political commitments that work on the local level. So the European, the national, and the local level can all work together. And this is exactly how I intend to deal with this. So I want to make sure that the social mobility, the homes, etc., agriculture, are all dealt with in terms of their social impact, as well as energy, of course. I will not develop nuclear, by the way. I'm in favor of the energy mix, but I'm concerned that we should not focus on nuclear power stations. This is a European issue, remember, of course. But if we focus on new power stations, nuclear power stations, that means we will not invest sufficiently in renewable energies, and that is what we need. And if we just focus even on the economic terms and geopolitical terms, if we just look in this sense, if we do not invest in renewables, they will be left to one side on the high value-added market. But if we remain isolated alone with our nuclear, then we will be left to one side. The US has their nuclear, etc. China has it on its own power, but we'll just be isolated on our nuclear, while the world economy, the global economies, are focused on renewables. A last point, which is an issue which is a bit less local. This is more an international issue. I think that for those who are the major polluters in the country, carrying on with deforestation, for example, in Amazon and Africa, etc., we need some sort of international justice system. I could argue for that, and the progressives in Europe can argue for this within Europe. So we need to have an international court on ecocide issues. I believe in law in this respect, and we need to move. We need to move in the local level, but also have these international institutions to deal with those who destroy resources and who have no right to do this. So the international community, like the Hague Court, for example, it could be a continuation of this towards ecological issues. I think this would help to provide a sort of fixed point to ensure that this great shift takes place. Thank you very much. So, Antonio Costa, to finish off with this debate. So what do you see the next developments in the European Green Deal? So how are we going to gather all these political forces? And basically, nobody can work on their own. So it's a difficult work that we need to undertake this work in Portugal and France and ensure that we can assemble these political wills, let's say. So you seem to be an expert in gathering people together. So in terms of mobilizing European political ideas in this respect, how should we go forward now?
Eh bien, merci pour cette question.
Thanks for this question. I think indeed we need to gather people together, need to work together, especially at the European level. There is no solution outside of the European basis. The EU needs to work together. I think there were two clear good examples in the last few years. First of all, the one on vaccination and our capacity to invest heavily in the energy transition and in the digital transformation. And this should give us confidence with regard to the future. There'll certainly be a lot of discussion on terms of budgetary issues in the EU. We've been lucky that we found some intelligence in the sense of interpreting the budgetary rules. We need to maintain our level of intelligence and respect. We shouldn't lose this with COVID, and we need to move forward to be able to invest in the future. If we have a single currency, we need to have common rules, but we need an adjustment for the after-crisis prices should be done, and this should be done in such a way that it can be compatible with the ability of each country to head for a common goal, but with factoring in the differences between each country. We need to not to forget the errors made in the past 10 years ago, for example. At Fontainebleau 10 years ago, under Sarkozy, the right, under Sarkozy and Merkel, decided to change their route in terms of, and this led to austerity, lack of economic growth, and above all, and gave a driving force to the populist forces. So we need not. So the political consequences that ensue. So secondly, we need to bear in mind one important issue, which has been supported by the Socialists, which is the European right, is neglected. That means a joint unemployment base within Europe. So the SURE program has been decisive in this respect, at least in Portugal, to ensure that jobs are protected. So we now have an unemployment rate in Portugal that is lower than before the crisis, because we've been able to support companies and give backing to jobs so that there are sufficient jobs, and so we can move forward and create a stimulus. Secondly, when we're able to find solutions in terms of next generation, we need to, for each investment, we need to ensure that European level is undertaken. So vaccination does not operate unless everybody is vaccinated. And the same applies with climate change. If I close my new coal power station, and the last will be closed in the 20th of November, for example. But if there's not a European level effort to make the investments that are required to ensure renewables and clean energy and safe energy, then things may be working well in Portugal, but that will not be the case Europe-wide and worldwide. So we need joint investment. Not golden rules, but let's say green rules, so to ensure that some investments, if we need to have a clear finance program for the European Union on a contractual basis to have these particular funds earmarked for these investments, then this might work. But what we cannot tolerate is to arrive in the after-crisis period and see that we've decided nothing and act as if we were in the same situation as before. There's been a big reaction within our company, and we must undertake this big shift, and this requires large-scale investment, and just which is green and fair and in favor of the general public. So she can put an end to this day. So I'm going off to France Inter radio station now to talk about the COP26. Thank you very much for your contributions. Good evening to everybody, dear comrades. Good evening, my friends, and good evening to Paris. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here today. And it's been a busy day with a lot of discussion and very symbolic. And the Mutuality House, now I'll carry on in Spanish because, as you can see, I need some more lessons to speak French in the future. So thank you very much, Anna, and to Antonio Costa and Pedro, and thanks to Sergei and Olivier. Today is a day of great importance and a great day for Social Democrats. And it's also the day when the COP26 is ended. The conclusions are symptomatic of the situation and the difficulties we face. They're less ambitious than the objectives set in Paris 6 years ago. And this is the reason why we're here today. Because with the current economic structures and the current economic base, it is impossible to put a limit on global warming. We need a radical change, a change to save the planet, but reflecting on the general public, ensuring that we're aware that this is difficult, but it's possible. So we need a clear vision. It requires work and basic principles and political will above all. And this is why we are here today, because European Social Democrats want to change structures. We want to do our utmost to ensure fair transition, more sustainable model for the environment and for the people in general. Fortunately, Europe has overcome the mantra policy. Now we're investing sufficiently in fair wages, etc., equality between gender balance, etc. And the economic foundation is not sufficient unless we have an improvement in the quality of life of people. It's not valid if we understride the environment. And people today now trust the Social Democrats. We are committed to our historical values, and we are seeking the right formula to meet a new reality. We are the same old Social Democrats with the same values, but we face a new reality, and which is changing fast. So we have contacted major experts to undertake this radical work. I'd like to thank all those who've taken part in the Independent Commission and the coordinators of this work, Teresa Rodriguez, Paul Rasmussen, and of course all the MEPs who have been involved in this work. For example, Andrew, of course, has been very important. My great friend has been very important in this whole process. There's been great political will and determination and work in this process, and he's done this with real determination and based on conviction and real values. Eric is the real driving force in this respect. And I'd like to thank him deeply for all the work he has done. And he's, of course, ensured that we've been able to attend today and organize this work today. There are clear proposals on the table. We have a clear story to tell. And there are clear proposals for the short, medium, and long term. This economy focused on the general public requires clear reforms and clear markers for human development. We saw this in the first roundtable where we talk about experts talking about sustainable development. We talk about human indicators, not just macro issues. This is the main difference we have within Social Democrats with regard to the past crisis. The crisis based on austerity does not work. And the idea that we could just move forward just on economic issues is not sufficient. And this has created a great deal of frustration and pain throughout Europe and destroyed the dreams of many. These micro issues can be transformed into social progress. This is why we're Social Democrats. We need to ensure that economic issues are reflected in the life standards for the poorest. So we need a law against poverty in Europe, which is binding, and which this is why we talk about social climatic change issues. This is no longer an option in the fight against climate change. We need to deal with this, and we need to have the right structures for the future generations. And we can't do this without, we need to undertake the transformation and the shift, and this needs to be undertaken without the poorest paying the bill for this. And this is dealt with in the report, to a law to protect the environment. It's a starting point to give some thought to these issues. And this is based in militants and on the local level and the social level. And we will encourage this to be adopted on the European level. This is a constant fight on a political level, and it needs to be undertaken on a participative level. All of us should be engaged in this commitment and move forward. So, as our others have said today, we need this vision, and thus we can take a Europe which is more digital, greener, more social, and of course a Europe which is more feminist. And we can only do this so this great shift can only be undertaken with us at work, that is with women, of course, and of course Anne Hidalgo is a vital ally in this, and we'll see what happens in the next elections in France, and we're convinced that together our Social Democrats can make forward, and I'm delighted with her presence today, and also with a clear compromise, and our work as forward is clearly laid out now.
Now we make.
Yes, can we please ask the speakers and the European Parliament members here on the stage? Merci beaucoup, muchas gracias, Irache e Pedro. Obrigado, Antonio Costa. Merci beaucoup, Anne Hidalgo et tous les autres orateurs. Merci beaucoup, les modératrices qui ont géré cet après-midi si magnifique. Écoutons la musique. Merci. Merci beaucoup d'être ici.
Thank you very much. So